The leader of the Roman Catholic Church, Pope Francis, prays before a 14-foot-long ancient linen cloth. The occasion attracts media attention because it is the first time that the cloth has been shown publicly in over 5 years. This Christian holy relic is referred to as the Shroud of Turin.
The Shroud of Turin is one of the most examined objects in modern history. For decades, some have claimed that science finally proved it wrapped the body of Jesus. Others say the evidence points in the opposite direction entirely. So what did researchers actually find when they studied this cloth? The answer is more complicated than either side usually admits. What the shroud actually is. Before we get into the research, here's the basic picture. The Shroud of Turin is a linen cloth measuring roughly 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. On it appears the faint yellowish-brown image of a man, front and back, as if the cloth had been laid lengthwise beneath a body and then folded up over the head. The figure shows wounds consistent with crucifixion, including marks on the wrists, feet, side, and scalp. The cloth is currently kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin, Italy, where it has been held since 1578. It is publicly displayed only on rare occasions. For some, it is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. For others, it is a remarkable piece of medieval craftsmanship. What people are saying online. If you search for the shroud today, you'll find a specific narrative dominating much of the content. The claims tend to sound like this. Some videos say that science has conclusively proven the shroud is the real burial cloth of Jesus. Others claim the image could not possibly have been created by any known human method, pointing to supernatural causes like a burst of radiation at the moment of resurrection. You'll also find confident statements that modern technology has confirmed the cloth dates to the 1st century and that the scientific mystery has essentially been solved in favor of authenticity. These narratives spread for understandable reasons. The image is genuinely unusual. When photographed in 1898 by Secondo Pia, the negative plates revealed a far more detailed and lifelike image than what the naked eye could see on the cloth itself. That photographic reversal struck many people as almost miraculous. Add to that the deep religious significance, the complexity of the scientific findings, and the natural human desire for a definitive answer, and you get content that tends to present interpretation as proof. The problem is that many of these videos leave out the parts that complicate the story, and those parts matter. If this is the kind of careful, balanced look at contested topics you appreciate, consider subscribing. We try to give you the full picture, not just the viral version. The 1988 radiocarbon dating, the most significant scientific test ever conducted on the shroud, happened in 1988. With permission from the Catholic Church, small samples of the cloth were given to 3 independent laboratories: the University of Oxford in the United Kingdom, the University of Arizona in the United States, and ETH Zurich in Switzerland. Each lab used radiocarbon dating, a well-established method for estimating the age of organic materials. The results were published in the journal Nature in 1989. All 3 laboratories independently concluded that the linen dated to somewhere between 1260 and 1390 CE. That places the cloth firmly in the medieval period, roughly 12 to 13 centuries after the crucifixion. The researchers gave the result a 95% confidence level. At the time, many in the scientific community considered the question largely settled. This often gets skipped in viral content. 3 separate, well-respected laboratories working independently arrived at overlapping medieval dates. That is not a small thing in science. The challenges to the dating. The radiocarbon result has not gone unchallenged, and the objections deserve a fair hearing. Some researchers, most notably the late chemist Raymond Rogers, who had worked on the shroud in the 1970s, argued that the sample used for radiocarbon testing came from a corner of the cloth that had been repaired at some point, possibly in the 16th century. If the sample contained a mix of original linen and newer fibers woven in during a repair, the result would skew toward a later date. Others have suggested that centuries of handling, candle smoke, fire damage, and microbial growth could have contaminated the cloth in ways that affect carbon dating. The shroud did survive a significant fire in 1532, which left visible scorch marks and water stains that are still present today. These critiques are real, and they've been published in peer-reviewed journals. However, they remain contested. Other researchers have pushed back, arguing that the repair hypothesis is not well supported by the physical evidence and that the laboratories took steps to clean the samples before testing. The 1988 dating is still the most widely cited scientific result on the shroud. The critiques exist, they are taken seriously by some researchers, but they have not overturned the original finding in mainstream science. The medieval date remains the default position in most scientific literature, even if the conversation hasn't fully closed. The image itself. Now we come to what is probably the most genuinely puzzling part of the whole story. Even researchers who accept the medieval date often admit that the image on the cloth is strange. In 1978, a group of American scientists known as the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP, was given direct access to the cloth for 5 days of non-destructive testing. They brought spectrometers, microscopes, X-ray equipment, and photographic tools, and they produced one of the most detailed scientific examinations ever conducted on a religious artifact. What they found is interesting. The image is extremely superficial. It affects only the topmost fibers of the linen, roughly the outer few microns. It does not soak through the cloth the way a painted or stained image would. The researchers found no evidence of brushstrokes. They did not identify a clear pigment layer that could fully account for the image. The darkened fibers appear to result from some kind of chemical change in the cellulose itself, not from an added substance sitting on top of the cloth. That is unusual, and it's part of why the shroud continues to attract scientific attention. However, and this is important, unusual does not mean supernatural. STURP concluded that they could not determine how the image was formed with the tools available to them at the time. Not being able to explain something is different from proving it has no natural explanation. Proposed explanations for the image. Researchers have proposed a number of possible mechanisms for how the image could have formed. 2 stand out as the most substantive. The first involves a chemical reaction between the linen and gases released by a body or by substances applied to it, such as burial ointments. This could, in principle, produce the kind of superficial discoloration observed on the outer fibers. The second, and more directly tested, comes from Italian researcher Luigi Garlascelli. Using materials and techniques available in the Middle Ages, he produced a reproduction of the shroud that shared many of its key features, including the superficial image and the faint three-dimensional properties. His work showed that a medieval artisan could, in principle, have created something resembling the shroud, though critics have pointed out that his version does not match the original in every detail. The honest state of the science is this. Medieval-style techniques can produce shroud-like images, but no one has produced an exact replica that matches every property of the original. The image remains difficult to fully explain, but it has not been shown to require a non-natural cause. The blood question. Another area that gets heavily discussed online is the presence of what some researchers have identified as blood on the cloth. Studies conducted by forensic researchers Alan Adler and John Heller in the late 1970s and early 1980s reported finding substances on the shroud that they identified as human blood, specifically mentioning hemoglobin and bilirubin. Some later studies have supported these findings. However, chemist Walter McCrone, who also examined samples from the shroud, argued that the reddish stains were not blood at all, but rather iron oxide pigments mixed with a protein binder, consistent with medieval painting techniques. He identified the material as red ochre and vermilion. More recent studies have continued to produce conflicting results. A 2018 forensic analysis published in the Journal of Forensic Sciences using bloodstain pattern analysis concluded that the blood flow patterns on the shroud were not consistent with the postures a crucified body would have taken, suggesting the stains may have been applied rather than naturally deposited. That study was itself criticized by researchers who accept the shroud's authenticity. There is no universal scientific agreement on whether the reddish marks are real human blood, artistic pigments, or something else entirely. Different labs using different methods have reached different conclusions, and the samples available for testing are extremely limited. The historical record, away from the chemistry, there's also the question of historical documentation, and this part tends to get less attention online. The first clear, verifiable historical record of the Shroud of Turin dates to the 1350s, when it appeared in the possession of a French knight named Geoffroy de Charny in the small town of Lire, France. Shortly after its appearance, the local bishop Pierre d'Arcine wrote a memorandum to Pope Clement VII in 1389, claiming that the cloth was a painted forgery and that an earlier bishop had even identified the artist who made it. That memorandum is a real historical document, and it complicates the picture significantly. Supporters of the shroud's authenticity argue that there are earlier references to a similar cloth, sometimes identified with the image of Edessa or the Mendelian, a religious artifact mentioned in Byzantine sources. However, the connection between those earlier references and the specific Turin cloth is not firmly established. There is no verified documentary trail leading back to the 1st century. An object believed to be the burial cloth of Jesus would presumably be one of the most important relics in early Christianity, and yet the clear historical record begins more than 1,000 years after the event it supposedly relates to. What the evidence actually supports. The viral narrative says, science has proven the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus. There is no scientific consensus supporting that conclusion, and the most widely cited dating evidence points toward the medieval period. The viral narrative says the image is supernatural and cannot be explained by any known method. The image is genuinely unusual, and its exact formation mechanism is not fully understood, but researchers have not ruled out natural causes and have produced partial reproductions using medieval techniques. The viral narrative says modern technology confirmed an ancient origin. Radiocarbon dating from 3 independent laboratories suggested a medieval origin, and while that result has been challenged, it has not been overturned in mainstream science. The viral narrative says the mystery has been solved. Some questions remain genuinely open, particularly around the exact mechanism of image formation and the nature of the stains. But this is different from saying the shroud has been authenticated. Why this debate continues. Part of why the shroud keeps coming back into the news is that it sits at an unusual intersection. It's a religious object, a historical artifact, and a scientific puzzle all at once. People bring very different expectations to it. For believers, the shroud is a physical connection to the central event of Christian faith. For skeptics, it's a case study in how easily interpretation can be mistaken for evidence. For researchers, it's a genuinely interesting object that keeps raising new questions as new technology becomes available. All 3 perspectives can coexist. You can find the shroud historically important, scientifically interesting, and still unresolved without having to collapse the answer into a single confident claim. The bottom line. So, what did scientists actually find on the Shroud of Turin? They found a linen cloth with an unusually superficial image that doesn't match conventional painting techniques. They found reddish stains whose composition remains disputed. They found, through radiocarbon dating, evidence pointing to a medieval origin, along with arguments from some researchers that the dating may have been affected by repairs or contamination. They found a historical record that clearly begins in the 14th century, with earlier connections that are debated but not firmly established. What they did not find, despite what many videos claim, is definitive scientific proof that the cloth wrapped the body of Jesus. And they did not find evidence requiring a supernatural explanation. The Shroud of Turin is not a solved mystery. It's also not a confirmed relic. It is, for now, an open question, studied carefully, debated honestly, and still capable of surprising researchers with new findings as methods improve. Science is comfortable saying, "We don't know." That honest acknowledgement is different from claiming a mystery proves anything, in particular. If you find yourself drawn to topics like this, where the real story is more interesting than the headline, consider subscribing. We aim to give you the careful version, not the loud one. Now we'd love to hear from you. Why do you think the Shroud of Turin continues to divide opinion, even after decades of scientific study? Do you see it as a scientific mystery, a historical artifact, a matter of faith, or something that fits into more than one category? Let us know in the comments.